Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had been looking forward to this joint training exercise for weeks. The military academy's advanced survival course was designed to push cadets and junior officers to their limits, testing both their physical endurance and mental resilience. What she didn't expect was that the real test would come from her fellow soldiers rather than the harsh wilderness terrain. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dense forest as Sarah adjusted her combat gear one final time. She was one of only 3 female participants among the 30-person training group, but that had never intimidated her before. Having served 2 tours overseas and earned commendations for her leadership under pressure, she felt confident in her abilities to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The exercise coordinator, Sergeant Major Thompson, gathered the group around a weathered map spread across a fallen log. His gravelly voice cut through the morning air as he explained the mission parameters. Teams would be dropped at different locations throughout the 50-square-mile training area, each tasked with reaching designated checkpoints while avoiding capture by opposing forces played by senior cadets. Sarah was assigned to Team Alpha alongside 3 male cadets, Jackson, Rodriguez, and Williams. She had worked with Rodriguez before during previous exercises and found him to be professional and competent. Jackson and Williams, however, were newer faces from a different battalion, and something about their sideways glances and whispered conversations made her uneasy. As the teams dispersed into the wilderness, Sarah noticed that Jackson seemed to be taking an unofficial leadership role despite her senior rank. When she attempted to suggest alternative routes based on her tactical experience, he would dismiss her input with condescending remarks about following orders. Rodriguez appeared uncomfortable with the dynamic, but remained silent, while Williams openly smirked at Jackson's behavior. The first day of the exercise proceeded without major incident, though Sarah found herself increasingly frustrated with her teammates' attitudes. They would deliberately exclude her from planning discussions, make inappropriate comments about women in combat roles, and question her decisions even when she was clearly more experienced than any of them. By the second day, the situation had escalated beyond mere disrespect. When Sarah successfully identified and disabled a simulated enemy position that the others had missed, Jackson accused her of showing off and trying to make them look bad. The tension in the group was becoming palpable, and Sarah began to suspect that their behavior was more coordinated than it initially appeared. That evening, as they made camp in a small clearing, Sarah overheard Jackson and Williams talking in hushed tones about teaching her a lesson. She pretended to sleep while straining to catch fragments of their conversation. Words like, "put her in her place," and "show her what happens," sent chills down her spine. But she told herself she was overreacting to typical military bravado. The third morning brought with it an ominous change in atmosphere. The men seemed unusually energetic and kept exchanging meaningful looks when they thought Sarah wasn't watching. When she suggested they split up to cover more ground in their search for the next checkpoint, Jackson insisted they all stick together for safety reasons. As they moved deeper into the forest, Sarah began to notice they were deviating from their planned route. When she questioned the change in direction, Jackson claimed he had spotted enemy movement and wanted to take a more circuitous path. Something in his tone made her hand instinctively move closer to her radio, but she hesitated to call for backup over what might be nothing more than poor leadership. The trees grew denser as they climbed higher into the hills, and Sarah realized they were moving away from all the designated checkpoint areas. Her military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every fiber of her being was now screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. When they reached a particularly isolated grove of oak trees, Jackson suddenly called for a halt. He claimed they needed to rest and reassess their position, but the predatory gleam in his eyes told Sarah that rest was the last thing on his mind. Williams positioned himself slightly behind her while Rodriguez hung back, his face pale and conflicted. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized the full scope of what was happening. These men hadn't brought her to this remote location by accident or poor navigation. They had deliberately led her away from the training exercise, away from help, away from witnesses. The isolation of their current position meant that even if she screamed, no one would hear her except the three men who had orchestrated this entire situation. Jackson's voice took on a cold, menacing tone as he began to speak about the need for female soldiers to understand their proper place in the military hierarchy. His words became increasingly threatening, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was in serious danger. Her training kicked in as she began to assess her options for escape or defense. The radio on her belt suddenly seemed like her lifeline to safety, but she knew that any obvious move toward it would trigger an immediate response from her captors. She needed to find a way to signal for help without alerting them to her intentions, but time was running out fast. Williams produced a length of rope from his pack with a sinister smile, and Sarah realized that whatever they had planned for her was about to begin. Her mind raced through possible escape routes, but the men had chosen their location well. The nearest trees were too far to reach before they could stop her, and the terrain offered little in the way of defensive positions. As the three men began to close in around her, Sarah made a split-second decision that would determine whether she survived the next few minutes. She lunged for her radio while simultaneously diving toward the largest nearby tree, hoping to put some barrier between herself and her attackers. The forest erupted into chaos as Jackson shouted orders, and the men rushed to subdue her before she could call for help. The struggle was brief but intense, with Sarah fighting desperately to maintain possession of her radio while trying to avoid the rope that Williams was attempting to loop around her wrists. Her combat training served her well initially, but the 3-to-1 odds quickly overwhelmed her defensive efforts. Within moments, they had forced her against the trunk of a massive oak tree, and Williams began securing the rope around her torso while Jackson held her arms. Rodriguez stood watch but appeared increasingly distressed by what was unfolding. Sarah's radio lay several feet away where it had fallen during the struggle, its metal casing cracked but potentially still functional. The rough bark of the oak tree pressed into Sarah's back as Williams tightened the ropes around her torso. Her wrists burned from the coarse fibers, and she could feel her circulation being slowly cut off as the bindings grew tighter with each passing second. Jackson stood directly in front of her, his face twisted into an ugly sneer of satisfaction. "This is what happens when women think they can play soldier," Jackson spat, his voice dripping with malice. "You've been acting like you're better than us since day one, and it's time someone taught you some respect." Sarah's training had prepared her for many dangerous situations, but nothing had quite prepared her for being betrayed by her own teammates. She forced herself to remain calm and assess her situation logically. The rope was tied professionally, suggesting that this wasn't a spontaneous act of anger, but something they had planned in advance. The realization that they had been plotting against her from the beginning made her stomach turn with revulsion. Williams stepped back to admire his handiwork, clearly pleased with how securely he had bound her to the tree. The rope crossed her chest in an X pattern and wrapped around the trunk multiple times, making it impossible for her to move more than a few inches in any direction. Her arms were pinned at her sides, and her feet were positioned awkwardly against the tree's root system. Rodriguez had been pacing nervously during the entire binding process, his face growing paler with each passing moment. Finally, he could no longer contain his discomfort with the situation. "Look, guys, maybe we've made our point," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We should probably untie her and get back to the exercise before someone comes looking for us." Jackson whirled around to face Rodriguez with fury blazing in his eyes. "Don't go soft on me now, Rodriguez. You knew what we were planning, and you agreed to it. She needs to learn that there are consequences for thinking she's hot stuff just because she's got some fancy medals." The argument between Jackson and Rodriguez gave Sarah a brief moment to test the strength of her bonds. She flexed her wrists and tried to shift her weight, but Williams had done his job well. The ropes held firm, and her attempts to loosen them only succeeded in making the bindings cut deeper into her skin. Williams noticed her struggles and laughed coldly. "Don't waste your energy, Lieutenant. Those knots aren't going anywhere. And neither are you until we decide you've learned your lesson." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to remember everything she had learned about escape and evasion during her military training. The instructors had covered scenarios involving capture by enemy forces, but they had never discussed what to do when the enemy was wearing the same uniform as you. The betrayal cut almost as deeply as the physical restraints. The broken radio lying several feet away caught her attention, and she began to formulate a desperate plan. If she could somehow activate the emergency beacon function, it would automatically transmit her GPS coordinates to the command center. The challenge would be reaching it without alerting her captors to what she was trying to accomplish. Jackson began pacing in front of her like a predator sizing up its prey. His rants about women in the military became increasingly violent and disturbing, revealing a depth of hatred that went far beyond simple prejudice. He spoke about teaching her lessons that she would never forget, and his words left little doubt about the nature of his intentions. "You think you're so tough because you served overseas," Jackson continued his verbal assault. "But let's see how tough you are when there's no backup coming and no commanding officer to hide behind. Out here, it's just you and us, and we make the rules." Sarah forced herself to remain silent during Jackson's tirade, knowing that any response would only escalate his anger. Instead, she focused on observing her surroundings and looking for any advantage she might be able to exploit. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the sound of Jackson's voice, and she realized that they were truly isolated from the rest of the training exercise. Williams began searching through Sarah's equipment, removing her knife, compass, and other survival gear with methodical efficiency. He seemed to be enjoying the process of systematically stripping away her defenses and leaving her completely helpless. When he found her backup radio battery, he held it up triumphantly before tossing it deep into the underbrush. Rodriguez's internal struggle was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. He kept glancing toward the broken radio and then back at Sarah's face, as if he was wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jackson, this has gone too far. We're going to be in serious trouble if anyone finds out what we're doing." "Nobody's going to find out because nobody's coming to look for her," Jackson replied with confidence. "We're supposed to be radio silent for the next 6 hours, remember? By the time anyone realizes something's wrong, we'll have taught her everything she needs to know about respecting her superiors." The mention of the radio silence protocol sent a chill through Sarah's body. Jackson was right that their absence wouldn't be noticed immediately, but he was wrong about one crucial detail. Before leaving for the training exercise, Sarah had arranged a check-in schedule with her husband David, who was stationed at the nearby helicopter base. He would expect to hear from her within the hour, and when he didn't, he would start asking questions. David Martinez was a decorated helicopter pilot with over 15 years of military experience. More importantly, he knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was in trouble, even from hundreds of miles away. Their marriage had survived 2 combat deployments and countless separations, and they had developed an almost telepathic connection when it came to sensing each other's distress. Sarah thought about the small emergency transmitter hidden in the lining of her boot, a personal safety device that David had insisted she carry despite regulations against unauthorized equipment. If she could somehow activate it, the signal would go directly to David's personal communication device rather than through official military channels. The challenge would be reaching her boot while tied to the tree. Jackson's voice brought her attention back to the immediate danger. He was explaining to Williams exactly what he intended to do to her, and his words made her blood run cold. This wasn't just about military hazing or teaching her a lesson about hierarchy. These men were planning to assault her, and they believed they could get away with it because of their isolated location. Williams nodded eagerly at Jackson's suggestions, clearly excited about the prospect of participating in whatever twisted revenge they had planned. His eyes gleamed with anticipation as he moved closer to where Sarah was bound, his intentions written clearly across his face. Rodriguez took several steps backward, shaking his head in dismay. "I can't be part of this," he said firmly. "You guys are talking about crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. This isn't what I signed up for." "Then maybe you should take a walk," Jackson snarled. "Come back in an hour when we're finished, and you can pretend you never saw anything. But if you try to interfere or report what happened here, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short career." The threat against Rodriguez was clear, and Sarah realized that even if he wanted to help her, he was now afraid for his own safety. Jackson's behavior had escalated far beyond anything that could be explained as a training exercise gone wrong. This was planned violence, and she was completely at the mercy of men who had already demonstrated that they had none. As Jackson began to move toward her with obvious malicious intent, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to activate the emergency transmitter in her boot through sheer force of will. She pressed her foot against the tree root as hard as she could, hoping to trigger the pressure-sensitive activation switch that David had shown her during their last leave together. Unknown to her captors, 47 seconds earlier, a faint electronic signal had begun transmitting from the forest floor, carrying Sarah's exact coordinates through the airwaves to a receiver in a helicopter that was already preparing for takeoff. Major David Martinez was reviewing flight plans in the helicopter hangar when the priority alert chimed on his personal communication device. The sound was one he had hoped never to hear, a sharp electronic tone that meant his wife's emergency transmitter had been activated. His blood immediately turned to ice as he stared at the GPS coordinates flashing on the small screen. Years of military training kicked in as David processed the information with lightning speed. The coordinates placed Sarah deep in the forest training area, miles from any designated checkpoint or safe zone. More troubling was the fact that she should have been maintaining radio contact with the exercise coordinators, but no distress calls had come through official channels. David's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he powered up the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The aircraft was technically assigned to a routine patrol mission that afternoon, but David made an executive decision to divert from that assignment. Something was desperately wrong with Sarah's situation, and every second of delay could prove fatal. The helicopter's rotors began spinning as David completed his pre-flight checks in record time. He had flown rescue missions in combat zones around the world, but none had ever carried the personal stakes of this particular flight. The woman he loved was in danger, and he was the only person who knew about it or could respond quickly enough to make a difference. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Jackson was advancing toward Sarah with predatory intent when the first faint sound of rotor blades echoed through the trees. The noise was barely audible at first, just a distant rhythmic thumping that could have been mistaken for woodpeckers or other forest sounds. Sarah's heart leapt with desperate hope as she recognized the familiar sound of military aircraft. "Do you hear that?" Rodriguez asked nervously, his head tilted as he tried to identify the source of the growing noise. The sound was definitely getting louder, and it was unmistakably mechanical rather than natural. Jackson paused in his approach and listened carefully. His confident expression began to falter as he realized that the sound was indeed a helicopter, and it was approaching their location with purpose rather than simply passing overhead. "It's probably just a routine patrol," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Williams looked around frantically as if he could somehow spot the aircraft through the dense canopy of leaves above them. "Should we hide? What if they're looking for us?" "Why would they be looking for us?" Jackson snapped, but Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The timing was too coincidental for comfort, and the helicopter sounded like it was heading directly toward their isolated grove of trees. Sarah's heart was pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. If rescue was indeed approaching, Jackson and Williams might panic and do something desperate to silence her permanently. She needed to find a way to signal the helicopter while avoiding any action that might cause her captors to harm her before help could arrive. The sound of the rotors grew steadily louder until it became a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Through gaps in the tree canopy, they could catch glimpses of the black aircraft as it circled overhead, clearly searching for something specific rather than conducting a random patrol. David's trained eyes scanned the forest floor through the helicopter's advanced surveillance equipment. The emergency transmitter had given him Sarah's exact coordinates, but the dense tree cover made visual confirmation difficult. He activated the aircraft's powerful speakers and began broadcasting a message that echoed through the forest, like the voice of an avenging angel. "This is Major David Martinez with the United States Army. I have received a priority distress signal from this location. If there are personnel on the ground requiring assistance, signal your position immediately." Jackson's face went white as he heard David's announcement. The use of Sarah's married name in the pilot's identification was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Somehow, Sarah had managed to call for help, and her husband was now circling overhead like a bird of prey searching for his target. "How did you contact them?" Jackson demanded, grabbing Sarah by the shoulders and shaking her violently. "You had no radio contact. How did your husband know where to find you?" Sarah remained silent, unwilling to reveal the existence of the emergency transmitter that had saved her life. Even tied to the tree and at the mercy of dangerous men, she wasn't about to give up the tactical advantage that knowledge of the device might provide in future situations. Williams was now in full panic mode, realizing that their isolated location was no longer an advantage but a trap. "We need to run," he said frantically. "If they find us here with her tied up like this, we're finished. Court-martial, prison time, the whole thing." Rodriguez, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, finally found his voice and his courage. "We need to untie her right now and get our story straight. This whole thing was insane from the beginning." Jackson's mind was racing as he tried to find a way out of the situation that wouldn't result in the destruction of his military career. The helicopter overhead represented the arrival of witnesses and authority figures who could expose everything they had done. His dreams of advancement and leadership were crumbling as quickly as autumn leaves. David's voice boomed through the forest again, this time with unmistakable authority and barely contained rage. "I am landing this aircraft in 30 seconds. All personnel on the ground will remain exactly where they are and prepare for immediate extraction and questioning." The sound of the helicopter's descent grew deafening as David maneuvered the aircraft toward a small clearing approximately 50 yards from Sarah's location. The downdraft from the rotors created a windstorm that sent leaves and debris flying through the air like a tornado had suddenly materialized in the peaceful forest. Jackson knew that time had run out for whatever plans he had harbored. With shaking hands, he began frantically untying the ropes that bound Sarah to the tree, while Williams gathered up their equipment in preparation for a hasty retreat. Rodriguez stood frozen in place, apparently resigned to whatever consequences awaited them. "When they question us, we say this was part of the training exercise," Jackson hissed as he worked to free Sarah. "Some kind of prisoner simulation that got out of hand. If anyone suggests otherwise, we all deny everything." Sarah felt the ropes loosening around her torso, but remained pressed against the tree until she was completely free. The circulation returning to her hands and arms was painful, but it was the most beautiful pain she had ever experienced because it meant she was alive and safe. The helicopter touched down in the clearing with David already unbuckling his safety harness before the skids had fully settled on the ground. He emerged from the aircraft like an avenging warrior, his face set in grim determination as he moved toward the sound of voices in the forest. Sarah stumbled away from the tree on unsteady legs, just as David burst through the undergrowth with his sidearm drawn and ready. The reunion between husband and wife was electric with emotion as Sarah collapsed into David's arms, her body shaking with relief and delayed shock. Jackson, Williams, and Rodriguez found themselves staring down the barrel of a very angry helicopter pilot's weapon while trying to explain how a routine training exercise had resulted in a female officer being tied to a tree in an isolated forest location. Their stammered explanations sounded weak and unconvincing even to their own ears. Within minutes, additional aircraft arrived on the scene as David's emergency calls brought military police and commanding officers to investigate the situation. The forest that had been so isolated and threatening just moments before was suddenly swarming with authority figures and potential witnesses. As Sarah gave her statement to the investigators, she looked up at her husband with profound gratitude for his quick thinking and decisive action. The emergency transmitter had worked exactly as designed, turning what could have been a tragic assault into a dramatic rescue that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Jackson, Williams, and Rodriguez were placed under arrest and escorted away in custody, their military careers effectively ended by their own criminal behavior. The investigation that followed would reveal evidence of premeditation and conspiracy, ensuring that they faced serious consequences for their actions. Later that evening, as Sarah and David finally had a quiet moment together, she reflected on how close she had come to becoming another statistic in the military's ongoing struggle with sexual assault. The intervention had been miraculous in its timing, arriving exactly when hope seemed lost and danger seemed certain. "How did you know something was wrong?" Sarah asked her husband as they sat together in the base medical facility, where she was being checked for injuries. David smiled and touched the emergency transmitter that had been carefully removed from Sarah's boot. "You forgot to turn off your guardian angel," he said softly, "and I'll always come for you, no matter where you are or how long it takes to find you." The story of Sarah's rescue became legendary within their unit, serving as both a cautionary tale about the dangers that female service members could face and an inspiring example of how quick thinking and technology could prevent tragedy. More importantly, it strengthened the bond between a husband and wife who had proven once again that their love could overcome any obstacle.